Welcome to Winning Wednesdays with Pear VC. At Pear, we've been fueling the next generation of tech startups for over 10 years. Working closely with founders since the beginning of their journeys, we've seen again and again that a good product isn't enough to build a meaningful business. You must also have a winning strategy and go-to-market. We believe that leveraging community, learning from one another, is key to establishing the right winning mindset, frameworks, and strategies.
Enter Winning Wednesdays with Pear VC, a 45-minute series on GTM topics with actionable insights for founders and teams building from 0 to 1. Our webinars are broken up in two parts. Part 1 will be a 25-minute presentation from a guest with GTM expertise, and Part 2 will be a lively Q&A. We are your hosts, the Pear GTM team, Pepe and Ana.
And today we're thrilled to have Jen Allen-Knuth with us, who will walk us through selling the problem, not the solution. Jen is the founder of DemandJen, amazing name, former Chief Evangelist Officer for the Challenger Sale Company, and former Head of Community Growth for Lavender AI. Prior to that, she spent 18 years as an individual contributor, selling 50 million plus in professional services as a new logo hunter and account manager. Jen runs cold outbound workshops and SKO keynotes for companies such as GE, G2, Square, Juniper Networks, and LinkedIn. We're so excited to have Jen here and think this will be enormously valuable. So we invite you to turn on your cameras and engage as Jen presents. And then, of course, tee up your questions for the end of and get ready for that Q&A. So without further ado, we'll give the floor to Jen. Thanks, Jen, for being here.
Thank you both for having me. I'm super excited to be here. And this is going to be a fast and furious little 30 minutes we have together. So let's get into it. Today we are talking about, as hopefully y'all know, selling the problem, not the solution. First thing, I'm going to share all these slides. They're meant to be pretty tactical. I have actual questions I use. I have frameworks, things like that. So don't feel like you got to take screen grabs or anything like that. My hope is there is a lot of utility in this following this event. So just know that. Okay, so I'm a big fan of getting to the punchline quickly because you might decide after hearing this, I don't even need to be here. And that's awesome if you don't. But if you do want to stay, we're happy to have you. So in the 18 years I spent as a seller, pretty much that entire time, I was selling a disruptive solution that was an intangible service that nobody thought they needed. And as much as that might sound like a negative, I think in many ways, that really helped me truly understand how to effectively sell and how to have sales conversations that made a prospect look at their own world a little bit differently. And frankly, in my opinion, that's all sales is just getting someone to revisit their assumptions around how their business is run, how things get done. Now, early, here's what I screwed up. And this is exactly what we're going to talk about today and how you get away from this. In sales, I think there's two major jobs to be done. So job number one is like the prospect has to believe that our solution, the problem our solution solves, is worth solving, and it's worth solving right now, not 6 months from now, right now. The second job to be done is to get that prospect to say, the way that you solve this problem is better than how we're solving it today. My problem, and what I got really wrong, is I would always start my pitch, my message, the way that I ran my conversations was built on trying to prove that we have a quote unquote better way for solving the problem. And there were plenty of deals where that person looked me in the face and said, you're absolutely right. You do have a better way of solving the problem. We just need to hold off for 6 months. And the reason for that is I was failing to address this first. I was failing to help my prospect decide or not decide whether this problem that we solve is actually worth solving and worth solving now. And so I lost a lot of deals to this. Now, there is a stat out there from Gartner, and this, I think my number was honestly way higher, that 38% of opportunities are lost to status quo. So the way to interpret this is not 38% of opportunities are lost because you don't have a good enough product or a good enough price or a good enough brand. It's because the prospect just ultimately decided, yes, you might have a quote unquote better way of solving the problem, but I'm actually okay with good enough. I know it's painful. I know it's not as good as it can be, but I got plenty of other stuff that is actually way too painful to let be. And so I'm just going to sit on this problem. That is status quo. Now, if you look in your pipeline or you look in your forecast and you take all the opportunities that are in there, and then you multiply that by 38%, those 38% more than likely will not be no's. They won't be yeses. They'll probably just be like, not right nows. And the problem with status quo is no buyer on earth ever calls us and says, thank you so much for sharing your product with me. I've just decided to stick with status quo right now. No one says that. Instead, they say things like, let's revisit this in 6 months. So I would be like, great, let me put it on my calendar. I'll call them back in 6 months. Meanwhile, they're just hoping that they're gone, I'm gone, something else happens, I forget. There is no meaning to the 6 months. It's just a way for them not to have to get into an icky telling me no conversation, which is uncomfortable for a lot of people. Or I'd hear the kiss of death, which is, great, thanks for showing me the demo. Now let me socialize this and get back to you. And then when we try to lean in and say, nope, I got it. Right? What that ultimately is, sometimes it's well-intentioned. They have the intention of socializing it, but then at the end of the day, after they've done 6 more calls after us, they realize socializing spending money is not a fun place to be right now. So maybe I said it with the best of intentions to do it, but now I'm confronted with reality, which is I have to go to all these people and be like, do you want to spend some money on this? Not fun. Or a lot of times as a seller, when I would hear, we don't have budget for this right now, I would think that's not my problem. They can't afford us. But this was often just a nicer way of saying, I just don't see a need to act on this problem right now. Or sometimes, frankly, they just give us crickets and they ghost us. When this happens, there's 2 ways I often see sellers reply. So number 1 is like, oh, not right now. Well, let me give you a discount to make it more attractive to act right now. I used to do this a lot, not recognizing that I could have probably made it free and they still wouldn't have done it because it was everything that came after the signature that was actually the hard part. Or I'd start tossing out, well, this company over here got an amazing ROI, 15 times ROI here, and this company had all these great outcomes. Great. I'm very happy for that company. But again, it comes back to this idea that I'm not arguing that you don't have a good solution. My point is, I just don't feel this problem is big enough to warrant action, whether the price is retail, 80% off, what have you. And so there's 2 enemies, and this is something I wished I learned way sooner in sales. The best sales hacks are about human psychology, not about say this or write this. There's 2 enemies here that make a lot of sense because of how we behave as human beings. Number 1, I put this quote on the page. I wish I could just scream this into every salesperson's ear. Better doesn't always defeat good enough. Like I said before, I could agree you have a better solution and still say I'm willing to tolerate good enough, because anytime human beings are confronted by change, there's 2 voices in our head. The rational brain is sitting there thinking, okay, I do like this, but my CFO just said we need to stop spending money. So now I have to raise my hand and get all these people to agree with me when I know they probably want other things and other problems to be solved. And then I have to do what nobody wants to do, build a business case. That sounds like the worst use of time ever. And then I put myself in front of the CFO who told me to stop spending and say, can I spend? Right? Rationally, most humans walk away from that. On the emotional side, this is what I call kind of the what if monster. So let's say you show me all of your case studies or the beautiful after and benefits of what happens if you implement our solution. Well, now I'm thinking about, what if I'm not like this person? What if I go through all of that hassle to build a business case, get buy-in, pitch it to our CFO, and then something goes wrong and everyone's like, who did this? Who changed the way it worked before? Well, that was me. That is political capital risk. And so buyers, before they buy, start thinking of these what if moments. And even if they were the ones to reach out and say, I'm interested in what you offer, they're now the people walking themselves back. So that's enemy number 1. Enemy number 2 is something that's been happening ever since the 2008 economic crisis, which is in 2008, a lot of leaders got left holding the bag, right? They made purchase decisions, cash was everywhere, no one cared. And then when it came down to be like, why do we have all of these licenses and no one's using it? It was like, oh, sorry, that was my bad. And so that stuck with them. And so what leaders started doing is saying, well, if I'm going to buy something, I'm not going to put myself in that position again. So even if I am the quote unquote executive decision maker, I'm still going to make sure that everybody on the team agrees with this. And so even if I do what we've always been preached to do, which is go in at the top and win over the executive decision maker, more often than not, they're still going to want to make sure that their team agrees with this. Because if they buy it and their team dissents, that reflects poorly on them. And so what you're seeing on this page is why for anybody who sells into even two decision makers or a buying group of two people, this is why it feels so hard. So basically what you're looking at is for people that say, I would like to buy your solution. If you only have one person you need to sell to, they have no one else they even need to tell about it, and they see value in your solution, you are in a good spot. You have an 81% likelihood of closing them. But look what happens the second you add one additional person to that buying group. Just a buying group of two, purchase likelihood drops down to 55%. You can see how messy it gets at 6. And then along the top, this is the average number of stakeholders that are getting involved in a complex deal. They stopped studying it in 2022, thank goodness, because who knows where this number and this number would be now. But I think we can fairly assume that with risk mitigation, it's just going up and this is probably going down. So part of the problem here, and one of the ways I used to mess up my sales a lot, is I would get one person who was really interested in what we offer. And I would think, okay, great, that person is so eager, they're going to go win over everybody. But what happens anytime you get a group of people representing different functions, different geographies, different roles, responsibilities, and you put them in the same room and try to get them to agree on anything at all, it's dysfunctional. Even if we're just talking about where should we order lunch from, right? That's a mess. Let alone, should we change the way we've always solved this problem? Should we invest money in something new? And so these two enemies make it such that I could have the best pitch and presentation in the world, and a buyer could still sit on the other side and say, I'm going to hold off for 6 months. And so let's look at what we can do and some of the, in my opinion, ways that traditional thinking around sales has misled us. So I don't know where everybody on this phone call learned how to sell. Everybody learns from different places. But largely, I've sold into sales for the last 21 years. Largely, there are 3 predominant approaches, and I've just sort of named them on the left, right? So the first one is, we're the best. Our solution will help you, for example, increase network reliability and save time. Well, there ain't a damn sales rep in the world who's going out there saying our solution is going to reduce network reliability and waste a ton of your time. And so from the prospect's perspective, it all sounds like white noise. Of course you are. Everybody in your category is telling me they're going to do that. The second is time suckers. Time suckers was an evolution in the early 2000s when people said, you've got to stop talking about your product. You've got to become more customer centric. And so what did we in sales do? We said, okay, I'll stop talking about us. Let me show up and ask with my hands out. I'd love to understand your goals and priorities. I am sure that you would, salesperson, because you want me to tell you problems so you can come back with the perfect solution on the back end. But what I didn't realize as a salesperson is that that is a high effort exchange for the buyer. So now I have to educate you on things that are largely out there, right? Thanks to ChatGPT, thanks to Google, thanks to YouTube. I have to educate you on our business in the hopes that maybe you can help us. It's a terrible exchange. So what do? They punt us down to the first line level. And then we've got this huge hill to climb to get back up there. The last one I call ugly baby. This was in recognition of saying, you can't show up with your hands out anymore. So what do? I come in and I say things like, other CIOs struggle to do this. Meanwhile, the person on the other end is like, who are you comparing me against? Who are these other CIOs? Are you comparing me against the best CIOs in the world? The worst CIOs? By the way, approaching someone and saying, I'm going to assume that you're struggling isn't the best way to build credibility or trust. No human being likes to be told, you look like you don't know what you're doing. And so it's not that any of these are wrong. It's just that are inherent flaws in their ability to actually get someone to reconsider how they're solving the problem. Now, I spent 18 years with the company behind the Challenger sale, so obviously I'm a huge fan of this body of work. largely because it is not someone's opinion of what do buyers value, but because it is one of the largest studies ever done on B2B buying behavior. And the quick byline on this, just in the interest of time, is that prospects do care about your brand, the quality of your products, and the fairness of your price. But the place where you have the biggest ability to make a difference is your ability to deliver a sales experience that teaches the customer about their own business, not yours. So these three things on the left, they matter. But often this is how you get into a consideration set. Over here is how you drive a competitive wedge. So let's talk about what that looks like and what we can do in response with our pitch. This is something that I think is probably very obvious to everybody on this call because you're founders. But when we step into a sales role, we tend to say, let me show you why my solution is great and how it works, which addresses this problem over here. What we fail to appreciate is every single executive reports to somebody, right? And that somebody is dictating a set of objectives that are important for that business to solve for this year. That person that leads that function is now coming up with a list of potential risk factors, things that I could do in my function that might make this objective not come to fruition. And then no one executive can afford to action all of those risks. So now they start doing something called cost of inaction sizing. If I let this risk go, how bad is it? If I don't hire another salesperson, like to what degree does that present a problem for our ability to crack into the enterprise? And so what that means is there are inevitably some risks that do not get actioned right now because the buyer has decided in their mind that there is not a sizable enough cost of inaction to not act on it. Only when they've decided that the risk is big enough do they start saying, okay, now let me think about my options to solve it. Can I solve it DIY? What solutions can I buy? What does that look like? When I look at a lot of sales outreach, and I do this all day, every day for my job, what I often see is we come in here. Here's an option for solving a problem. And we let prospects decide on their own whether or not the problem we solve is risky or not. And that means we are dwelling in this really tiny population of the market, like the 3% that's decided they have a problem and a problem worth solving. And that's where everybody else is. And so what I took away from this is once I realized my best opportunity to build high quality deals is by coming in here with a point of view in my message, both in my outreach and in my first call, that totally changed how I approached my message. So I'm going to give you a really simple example, and then I'm going to back into a very simple framework that you can use to apply this same idea to whatever you're selling. So I want you to pretend, for the sake of pretend, that you are selling packable raincoats. I know most of you probably, all of you probably aren't, but let's just say you are selling packable raincoats. And the reason you're selling packable raincoats is because it is a better alternative to carrying an umbrella. So in this scenario, the umbrella is your customer status quo, and the packable raincoat is your solution. Now, I'm going to do what most salespeople do. I'm going to tell you all the reasons why our packable raincoat is a better way to solve the problem. The problem is staying dry. I'm going to tell you that you can fit it in your bag so you never forget it. I'm going to tell you that it covers more of your body so you don't get wet like you do with an umbrella. It doesn't invert if it's windy, so you never look like a moron walking around on the street. I'll go on and on about all these benefits. And then the prospect will say, okay, how much is it? $100. $100? That's too expensive. I've got umbrellas at home. They keep me dry. That works just fine. That is exactly how status quo plays out in our business. And you're not selling packable raincoats, but you can insert your solution here, an umbrella here, and that is often how these conversations sound. So as a salesperson, I cannot change the product. I cannot change the price. All I can change is how I talk about it, the message. So watch how I talk about the same product using a different message. Now, in this scenario, I actually worked this out. So I'm going to give you some facts and then I'll tee you into the message. Average American owns 2.1 umbrellas. Only 5% of Americans remember to pack an umbrella on days it's supposed to rain. I am absolutely part of that 95% who forgets. And then Chicago, where I live, gets 119 days of rain a year. Now, keep those in mind as I walk through the message. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm not going to blast this packable raincoat to everybody who has a heartbeat. I'm going to start with propensity to have the problem my solution solves, which is getting wet outside. So that's probably Miami. Chicago's pretty heavy, Seattle, London. I could go on and on. I'm going to focus my efforts there instead of just blasting into the ether and destroying my domain deliverability. Now I'll zone in on Chicago. What I'm looking for are people who live and work in the city of Chicago, because the assumption or the hypothesis is they probably have to commute back and forth to work. They're not getting in a car and getting on the highway, which means they are more likely to get caught in the rain. Now, all that said, here's what the new message sounds like. Jen, noticed you live and work in the downtown Chicago area. Not sure if you knew this, but on average, Chicago gets about 119 days of rain a year. Now, the average American owns about 2.1 umbrellas, but only 5% of us remember to pack an umbrella on days it's supposed to rain. When that happens, how often do you end up ordering an Uber only to get hit with Uber surge pricing because it's raining, and that's what Uber likes to do? So we end up paying $40 for a ride that probably should cost us $15. If that happens 5 times a month, which it probably does, given the fact that there's 119 days of rain, those Ubers end up costing us $200 a month. Has that ever happened to you? Now, the thing I am not talking about in that message is my raincoat. I'm not talking about my solution, because I have no idea at this point if this is one of the 5% who loves to frolic in the rain, never forgets their raincoat. I also don't want the prospect to decide I don't need a raincoat because I already have an umbrella. My goal here is to get them to hold up a mirror to say there is an unintended negative consequence to the way we are solving the problem today. It is not the umbrella itself. The umbrella keeps us dry. It's the fact that our behavior is such that most of us forget the umbrella. And you can draw the parallel to any stakeholder, any function in the business. There are unintended negative consequences that in our minds sound really good. I have an umbrella that keeps me dry. Problem is, I keep forgetting it. And so this is what when I say cost of inaction, this is our ability to shape our buyer's perception of their problems and the importance of those problems. And I'm not saying that ROI doesn't matter. Right? Like ROI, though, is inherently flawed for solving job number one, which is helping that prospect decide if they have a problem worth solving and worth solving now. Because ROI is saying, if you do something, which we know we as humans hate doing, right? It's like, you got to take an action. You might see this return. It's not guaranteed. Cost of inaction is really effective early, because what we're saying is by changing nothing, you are seeing this unintended negative consequence, risk, or cost. And so there is a very big difference in how and where we use them. The mistake I was making is I was leading with ROI, hoping that if I talked enough about all the good things that happen, if you just take action, people wouldn't be able to resist it. But ROI is really much more effective at that job number 2, which is like, I trust that if I work with these people, the problem will get better. So here's what this backs into. All you need to do to sort of get your hands dirty and start trying this is take an account that you've been unsuccessful getting into or selling into, and use either ChatGPT, Google, whatever way, internal conversations to figure out what is it that that company is trying to do, not the executive. What is it that company is trying to do? Are they trying to grow in a particular region? Are they trying to reduce expenses around a particular line item? Like, what are the big things? My like tip I love here is I use ChatGPT. I'll go in and I'll say, what's the most recent interview with the founder of, this startup, or the CEO of this public company, or the dean of this university, depending on who you sell into. And oftentimes what you'll find is you'll find written interviews, or you'll find like YouTube interviews. You can copy and paste the transcript, put it into ChatGPT, and start asking it questions. Like if you sell a talent solution, that CEO talking about talent at all. And then what that tells you is what is important to that company, because everybody in the business is going to be marching against those orders. Then you've got to pull out, are any of those things relevant to what we do? And this was like a harsh reality I needed to learn. If the CEO does not have, or the founder or the dean does not have a set of objectives that we impact, I can have the best solution in the world. It's just unlikely when we get to the point of like CFO, CEO, founder approval that they're going to say, sure, this has nothing to do with anything that's important to us, but let's go ahead and buy this. It's just like a higher hill to climb. So I want to pull out, are there any objectives they talk about that I know relate to the problem we solve? And then here's where we've got to take off our like we're better hats and be far more empathetic. So here's where either at a one-to-one level or at a macro level, like industry verticals, company size, I start coming up with a list of what are all the status quo alternatives to solving the problem with us. So what are the homegrown things? What are the other solutions that are out there? If it's like even just bits and pieces, that it then becomes my list of things I need to start understanding what beliefs and assumptions might be causing these people to believe that that approach is good enough. So I'm going to share just the example I just gave. I'll tell you like exactly what I mean by this. In the last example, the objective was staying dry, which is the one that we solve. How do they appear to be solving for it today? I don't know how every single American stays dry, but I can largely assume most have an umbrella. So I'm going to say most probably use an umbrella. And the belief and assumption that causes someone to believe the umbrella is good enough is, well, umbrellas are cheap. So now that tells me my job is I have to break this belief or assumption that umbrellas are cheap. And the interesting thing is, umbrellas are cheap. You can buy an umbrella for like $5. But the behavior of us forgetting the umbrella is expensive. And so that tells me the information I have to give them is to hold up a mirror and help them realize it's not the umbrella. It's actually the pattern of not using it. So in this case, the raincoat costed $100. In this case, not using my umbrella was costing me $200 a month. This now becomes, the raincoat becomes the less expensive option, even though I didn't change the price. And it's all because I went through this thinking like a buyer instead of thinking like a salesperson or a founder who wants to, quote unquote, convince someone to buy something. So in the interest of time, because I know it's really important we have questions and do Q&A, what I've put in the appendix, because this was teaching the core idea, is then I put in how I actually open and run the first conversation. So that's my prep work for the call. And then here's how I actually bring that to life. Because what I'm not going to do is come in guns blazing to that call saying, I know you're wasting $200 a month because you don't use our umbrella, because that just creates this like defensive motion from our prospects. So you'll notice there's a theme here, which is I'm using that prep and that point of view, but I'm seeking to be corrected at every turn. Then I'm starting to introduce that like flawed belief or assumption underneath it, but I'm still doing it in a way where I'm not pointing the finger. And then I'm leading up to, here's a way to size that problem. So in that example, again, I'm just using it because it's an example we can all relate to. I might have that person at the end of the call, I might say, I don't know that it warrants you taking action, but why don't you pull your, last 30 days of Uber rides to see how much you spent on Uber? And then I can kind of take a look at what the weather was, right? If that was a big enough account for me, I could totally do that and then land that plane saying, I have documented evidence that you're falling into this trap. More often than not, I probably don't even have to do that because it's just such a human, relatable thing. Like, I don't even need to look at my Uber bill. I know I just did this 3 times. So the point of why we do this way, to put a bow on this, and then we'll go back to Q&A, is because one of the things I think I failed to appreciate when I started selling is there is already a solution. Right? It might be a terrible solution. It might not work very effectively. But humans by nature are way, way, way more wired to stick with the devil they know versus change. This goes back to prospect theory by Daniel Kahneman. We don't change as humans. We like safe. We like familiar. So we can't expect a person to say, sure, let me jump on an unknown and go through all the pains of implementation, telling my team we're going to do something new, introducing a new process, unless they perceive that what they are currently doing is actually way more costly than the cost of change. And the cost of change is not the physical cost of your solution. It's all the things around it that have to change in order to bring that solution to life. So I know that was fast. I know that was furious. Like I said, I put those slides in there, so we'll share them after so you can see how I pulled into a conversation. But let me shut up because I've been talking a lot and see if and where we have questions.
That was incredible, Jen. Thank you so much. I think we all want you to keep talking. So please, folks, don't be shy. Jump in with your questions. We already have a hand up. So Kaveh, please go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. So first question, the problem with the umbrella is that you forget to pack it. How about if you forget to pack your raincoat? So the customer comes back to you with that.
So this is getting back to what is the unique differentiator for the raincoat. Remember, the raincoat is a packable raincoat. So I missed this part. So I appreciate you calling it out. When I gave you the first example, I talked about how it's small and it fits in your bag so you never forget it. But I didn't give you a reason to value that, because in your mind, you're like, but I could just pack my umbrella. But now what I'm doing is I'm leading to the differentiator. It is cumbersome to pack an umbrella in our bag, but if I've got a little package like this, that's far easier. So my point there is that's the reason we created this packable umbrella. It's because you stick it in your bag, you never have to remember to pack it. So if it was just a raincoat, that wouldn't work. But what I'm essentially doing is I'm saying you all created a solution based off of a problem. We become so inherently close to it that we fail to appreciate that because we are so close to it, we have probably a deeper understanding of the problem than often our prospect does. And so we lead with those things, assuming they see the world the way that we do. This is kind of turning that on its head and saying, end with your unique differentiator, don't lead with it, because the customer often doesn't have a reason to care up front.
Thank you.
I love
Great
that.
question.
Connected to you call it a packable umbrella, sorry, a raincoat, and it's almost like always packed raincoat, right? It's like in there. That problem is
Exactly.
not, it goes away. Please don't be shy with questions. I have a question actually that I wanted to ask you, Jen. Given that amazing graph that you showed us on how adding additional decision makers makes a sale harder, I'm actually working with a founder right now whose product touches so many parts of the org that you kind of have to have buy-in from the many different departments. So but all the different users basically that will interact with this product. What do you do in that case where you're like, I want to figure out, obviously you're looking for that champion, you're looking for the primary person who's going to make the decision, but you need to involve other people. So it's almost like the committee isn't a thing that you introduce, it's a must in that product type. What do you say in those cases?
Yeah, so this is a pitch for myself, but it's free. So if we count that as pitch, tomorrow I'm walking through my 7 steps for taking a champion and then getting buying group consensus. So I'll drop that in the chat in a moment, because I used to get that absolutely wrong. The mistake I made is I'd get one person interested. They'd be like, let me go socialize this. And I'd be like, here's all my collateral. Here's the price. Have at it. And then I'd never hear from them again, because they'd probably walk into that room. They'd say, I've got a perfect solution. And then everybody else in the buying group is like, that's not my number one problem. Cool for you, but I'm not supporting this. And so the mistake I was making is the same mistake I talked about today. I was leading with the solution instead of leading with the problem. And so now what I do is, before I ever talk solution with a wider buying group, I know that I have to first and foremost get that buying group to agree that this is the right problem and the right problem to solve right now. And so the way that I do that is very counter to how most of us learned how to sell, which is, in that motion, I'm trying to convince. I'm trying to convince you that you need it, and I'm not listening to what the buying group actually wants. So instead, what I'm doing is I'm taking that cost of inaction theory I came up with one person. I'm bringing that to the group. And I'm saying, here is one person's opinion of the size of this problem. But John, I see that you lead this team over here. So I imagine it's probably a little bit more important for you to think about this problem over here. And then this is one of my favorite questions ever. How should the group weigh these two problems? Because what that requires is someone thinks out loud, and then it becomes very obvious if that person is me-centered or we-centered. Meaning, if they're like, well, I need to do this because I need to get this done, they now diminish themselves in the rest of that buying group, because now that person is looked at as a climber. If someone starts talking about valid objections and skepticisms, great. I want that because I'm in the room. What I don't want is that happening when I've hung up because I've created an unsafe environment where they don't feel okay disagreeing. So there's this technique in facilitation called prompting, where you're actually working with your champion in advance to ask questions like, who is most likely to be skeptical of solving this problem and why? What else would they put above it? Who is most likely to want to protect status quo and why? Like when I was selling the Challenger sales methodology, there was almost always someone in the buying group who created their own homegrown methodology. And it wasn't that they hated Challenger. They're just like, I don't want to stop this because I made this and my life gets harder if we switch. So if I know that in advance, I can now start seeding questions in that buying group. But that means I've got to slow my sale down. I can't rush from interested champion to, now everybody is interested. So I'm doing a terrible job walking through all 7 steps, but I'm breaking down the 7 steps tomorrow in a webinar, and it's free and anyone can attend if you're interested, if you're feeling that.
I would love to be there. So please do share the link. Many of us would. We have another question from Kaveh, but I want to just open it up to make sure anybody, I know we already got a question from Kaveh, but Kaveh, please, while we're waiting, I don't see any other hands.
So one thing I noticed on the chart of the committee numbers, so the percentage dropped to 55% when there were 2 people, but somehow it went back up to 60% with 3 people and 4 people. How do you explain that? Is it related to what you just covered right now?
You're coming with all the best questions. So there's no way to know for sure, but the theory of the case is if I am in a 2 versus 1 scenario, I am more likely to probably back down versus if I'm in like a 7 versus 6 scenario, right? Because I've got an army of people who see my side. There's almost an argument to be made that there is more political risk to be lost if I'm fighting against everybody else. The 4-person one, I don't have a great answer to. Like, as much as I've had this conversation, I don't know what magical thing happens at 4. Maybe it's just a tiebreaker situation. I don't know. But the 3 one, I've definitely seen happen in my own deal. So that one anecdotally makes sense to me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
That was great. Question, Kaveh.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just jumping in. Is it okay?
Yeah,
Please.
totally hear you.
Yeah. Thank you for I think it was a very informative one. So I'm not a founder, exclamation, just wanted to call that out. I'm a product manager in a startup and I'm trying to
Great.
make my product work, basically make it profitable, right? So, and it's in a healthcare space. So, and my sales team says the typical B2B sales cycle for my products is around 16 to 18 months. So, and I'm not able to understand what type of questions. So this is what is going in my mind, that is it because there are a lot of buying, as you said, the number of people making that buying group is very high, or is it because we are not doing the right prompting as you suggested? So any things for me to take as practical action items for my next conversation with my sales rep will be very helpful.
Yes, this is such a great point. And healthcare is a beast, right? Like they felt this well before every other industry felt this, because the other interesting shift there is and I don't know what exactly you sell, so I might be flawed, but in general, it's like you went from a buying decision that was made at the doctor surgeon level, and now it's like 10 levels above that.
Yeah.
And oftentimes like they don't even have any say in it. So you've got people making financial decisions. So I would argue that this type of model works even more effectively there because the top of the house doesn't care. And again, I don't know what you sell, but like they don't care if it reduces carpal tunnel for the doctor's hand to not use an instrument like this. They're like, I don't care. Like this doctor makes a lot of money. He should suffer. But what they do care about are things like absenteeism and do we have a lot of nurses and doctors out of commission because of a preventable injury? So again, not knowing exactly what you sell, my advice is we've got to think about the level of who makes the decision and separate ourselves quite a bit, honestly, from the direct product impacts and start thinking about the trickle down of negative consequences until we get to a point where we're now starting to talk about things that buyer cares about. So I would, if I was selling into a hospital system, I'd be doing that prompt I talked about, being like, what is, the Advocate here in Chicago, like what is the CEO of Advocate talking about? Are they talking about reducing expenses? Are they talking about implementing AI into their product offering? Like what are they trying to do? And then I would work that narrative back to that if I could. If I couldn't, then I'd probably go back to the drawing board and be like, we got a product issue here.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sapita.
Thank you so much, Jen. It was really insightful. We just took a screenshot of the many slides. They're like amazing. And we learned a lot. So I have a question. When you made mistakes and you forgot to address job number 1, and now you did only job number 2, or you made a lot of mistakes, how do you solve it? How do you go back and fix the broken sales that you did?
I love this question because in sales, I think we have this attitude where we have to be perfect and we never screw up. And that's just very not human. I am a big fan of calling out the elephant in the room. It's one of the best ways to build actual trust and credibility. So one of my favorite lines is I'll say, I was looking back at our last conversation or listening to the call recording of our last conversation, and I realized I made a rookie mistake. And then whatever dumb thing I did, I call it out. And people love it because salespeople are supposed to be aggressive and don't listen. And when you break that, I find that it creates this really good connection. It doesn't always mean I get the deal saved, but it sure as hell has made a big difference to whether I get another shot at that deal. So use the rookie mistake line. People eat it up.
I love that. And
Thank you.
Yeah.
remembering that you're a human and they're human, right? And that'll endear them to you. Sergio.
Yes, so I have a question related to enterprise sales, where it's similar. I assume it's part of the similar problem of the committee, but it's not a committee that makes a decision in agreement. It's just their roadblocks, like the data security, privacy, IT gets involved, legal gets involved, right? So they're not part of your users. They're not benefit. They're just hooks to go through. What's your best strategies related to that? Like,
Yes.
is it more creating like documentation that you kind of know how companies operate, but also certain documentation opens certain conversations that might have not been needed? Please.
Yes. Great question. I've sold enterprise my entire career. And yes, this is the bane of enterprise. So what I typically do is when I'm doing some of that upfront questioning, which I'll talk about tomorrow, I'm also asking things like, or I'm saying things like, listen, when we get to this point and we start to involve other people in the group, you're obviously going to think about the people who have touch and feel the problem and their bosses. But one of the things I find that will sometimes totally bomb a deal late stage is we haven't created an awareness with the other people that are accountable for getting this done, like IT, like audit, like privacy. They're pulled in at the last final mile and they don't understand the magnitude of the problem. So if it's okay with you, what I'd like to recommend is that we pull them into this so they get to hear the same conversation and they understand the organization's urgency around this instead of me as a sales rep knocking on their door trying to get them to do things faster. Is that okay with you, or is there any reason you might object to that? And the reason I find that often, not always, but often works is because you are putting their best interests first, right? Like you don't want to do all this work and then get to the final mile and that person throws up a roadblock. You also don't want to put it on that champion to have to solve for all that by themselves. And so what you're essentially doing is framing it through the context of, I'm trying to avoid this late stage roadblock because in our experience, we know that on average, these people tend to get involved and they're often brought in late. So I think anytime you can frame it around the negative for them, it causes them to kind of step back and at least consider it.
Thank you.
Great question.
Kaveh, please jump in.
Sorry, I don't want to be asking too many questions.
Stop it. You've got the best questions. Keep them coming.
So you had a slide titled Enemy Number One, Better Doesn't Always Defeat Good Enough. And you had the rational brain versus the emotional brain. Beyond the strategy of selling the problem rather than the product or the solution, do you have any other strategies in getting people to start actually using the emotional side of their brains without being manipulative or anything? Like, how do you approach somebody in a way that says, look, I'm not trying to trick you into buying my stuff. I'm actually really trying to figure out what problem you have and how I can help you solve it. But is there a way for you to actually make them use the emotional side of their brain without being particularly manipulative?
Another killer question. I found that when I looked at my conversations, I was the reason they were evaluating things rationally because my pitch was rational. So I had a great manager who said, if you don't like something your prospects are saying, look at what you did right before they said the thing you don't like and figure out what you said that caused them to say that. And so when I looked at how I was selling the challenger sale methodology, I was doing this like, we work with all these companies and we do this well, and here's what the program looks like. And then they're sitting there saying, all right, well, let me evaluate it. What I did not do is go in from the perspective of, gosh, there's no worse feeling than at the end of the quarter when your sales team has forecasted to hit 200% of your quota, and then you come in at 60%, and you're the one that's got to walk into the CEO's office and defend why that happened. Like, that is an emotional story that is designed to evoke an emotional reaction, but I wasn't selling like that. So I was getting what I was putting out there. So I would take a close look to how are you teeing up the problem state? Is it far more rational or is it emotional? And one of the things about that stupid umbrella story is like, there is a rational component to it, which is calculating the cost of using an umbrella. But way more of the story is emotional. It's like that very human moment where you're sopping wet in the rain because you did something stupid. Like, we've got to think long and hard around what is the problem I'm storytelling, or am I just storytelling what happens if you solve the problem?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great question. Sergio, please jump in.
A different question. Now they're coming up a lot of AI tools that empowers you, note-taking, action items, and so on. Do you have any favorite tools or experiences that you can advise that can make us more powerful or more efficient, be able to spend more time talking to customers, less on documentation, recapping, etc.?
Yes. Okay. This is just my personal opinion. So I don't mean offense to anybody who disagrees with it. We're all different. Do not use them to write emails. Do not use them to write emails. Do not use them to write emails. What I do really advocate for, there's two that I personally just find a lot of value out of. So Fathom is a note taker that I use that is free. I'm all in on free because I'm a single person business. So it does a phenomenal job. The reason I advocate for it is note taking is essential because I think the best thing we can do is speak in the language of our buyers. And if I'm trying to capture that, like how they talked about a problem, the exact problem language, I often miss it. So I do like a note taker for being able to make my buyer tell through the way that I write to them that I was listening. So that's number one. Number two, the company that I used to work for, Lavender, I think one of the hardest things that we don't pay enough attention to is when you get into a sales role, you have to write vastly different than the way that we grew up learning to write to get an A on a paper or a test, right? Like when I was trying to write to get an A on a paper, I'm using all my big words. I'm using all my complex sentences. Like I'm flexing all of these fancy things. And then I step into a sales role and I write emails like that. And people are like, this is boring. This sucks. No, thank you. And so what Lavender does is it's essentially like a cold email writing coach. And I'm not pitching this because I get any money. I just really believe in the product. It's why I worked there. It actually will read your cold email and it will grade it. And it will say, if you have like a 6-word subject, that dings out of 100 points, you get like 5 off for that. If you use massively large words that confuse your buyer and create effort, you get dinged for that. And so the first time I used it, I put what I thought was an incredible email in there and it beat it up. And I think it graded it like a 70. And the reason it does that is because it's constantly analyzing billions of cold emails to look for patterns around what helps or hurts reply rates. And as you use it more, it gets smarter on your own unique use case. So I'm a big advocate of AI that helps make the human skill better instead of replacing the human skill. And that's what that does. So I've found it to be tremendously helpful, not just for cold emails, but even follow-up emails, proposals. Your girl likes to get wordy.
Jen, I want to jump in on and kind of building on that question with a question about anticipating problems. So we obviously have problems today, and because of AI, a lot is shifting in any org, really. And so there was a question submitted before as people registered around tackling a problem that they know and they're living today versus an anticipatory problem. And what might you say about figuring out which of those problems is the right problem to go after?
This is a tough one, right? Because I would always say you want to touch on problems that people feel today. Like if someone's like, Jen, you might have a heart attack in 10 years. I'm like, okay, it's 10 years from now. So I'll deal with it when it comes, right? It's I think, again, human behavior that we punt risk or punt like benefits. So I would say focus on the problem they feel now and then show how that problem grows as a result of whatever the disruption or change is, right? So if I was selling lavender today, I could talk about the pain now of booking meetings off of cold email, but I could also talk about the future expense of using an AI SDR that's writing terrible emails and just doing them at a scale that is destroying our demand deliverability. So it's like, I think you can do both, but I don't think I think it's harder to sell for a future state than it is for a current problem state. So figure out, is there something about current problem, if they don't solve it now, that makes that anticipatory problem worse in the future?
Yeah. And then I'm going to get to these hands up, but I wanted to ask about pilots because that was another question that we got
Yes.
from multiple registrants. How do you fold in the pilot? Basically, you know, they already are in, feeling this problem. You're selling to that problem. Where does the pilot fit in, and how do you navigate that?
Yep. I just put a book name. I'm not a big like sales book person. Let me be totally honest with you. I just find them very boring. But there's a great book called The Jolt Effect. So what we talked about today is solving for status quo, which is getting the prospect to say, I think I should solve this problem and I think I should solve it now. There's a second big problem that occurs after that, which is indecision. Indecision is like, I know I need to solve the problem, but there's so many options and I'm overwhelmed with what to do. And one of the things they talk about in the Jolt Effect is intentionally using pilots to help give someone confidence versus biting off the whole apple. So that entire book is about how do you solve, once you win the status quo problem, which is what we talked about today, now how do you solve for indecision, which is a total other barrier. But I think there's an order to it, right? I feel first I have to be impassioned about solving the problem to even have the luxury of an indecision problem. So it's a great book to read if you haven't heard of it so far.
Great. Okay. I think these might be our last two questions. So I'll wrap up with a question after that we ask every guest. But Kaveh, please jump in with your question.
So if you are working at a startup that is pre-product and you don't have anything to sell yet, how do you approach the problem of being a time sucker? You had a slide where you had
Yes.
I'd love to understand your goals and priorities, and the prospect thinks you called me, I don't have time to educate you. But you sometimes need to actually do a little bit of that to make sure that you're not just developing a technology in search for a problem, but you're actually trying to really solve somebody's problem. And in order to do that, you need to actually do a little bit of that time sucking. How do you do that for a pre-product startup?
You never miss, my dude. You never miss. Okay. I would come back to this. So the way I would tee this up, sorry, let me kill all these other screens here. The way that I would tee this up is I would first say, like, I've got to give this person a reason to want to spend time with me. So I'm still doing the same work. Like, notice it seems like your company is trying to do X. And as a result of that, one of the things I often hear that makes that hard is why. I've got a couple ideas as to why that might be, but candidly, it would be helpful to know if my ideas are wildly off base. And so I think what we have to do is we have to, I hate saying this, but I think it's true. We kind of have to earn the right to suck someone's time. And I think what most people are looking for is like, are you just showing up completely blind and being like, can you help me with this? Can you give me answers? Is very different than when someone says, this is what I've observed on the outside. This is how I anticipate the problem might be playing out, but I can also appreciate I'm a complete outsider. And before I take any steps further, I'm looking to have some of my assumptions corrected. Again, the humanity of that, I think, is like, it's human nature to want to help. But if someone is drowning and they're just standing there with their arms to next to your side, you're like, I don't want to help this person. They're not even helping themselves. So that's the analogy I think of. What am I doing to show I've tried the best to my ability to come with some ideas? Because it's way easier to engage in a conversation where someone's asking you to correct versus where someone's holding their hands out and saying, feed me and teach me.
Thank you.
Okay, Sapide.
Hey, hello again.
Hey.
So I have a question. There are many times that you get some sort of feedback that you can build on top of. There might be some objectives, there might be something that you can work around. But as you said, there are sometimes just crickets. People just don't respond or just like say nothing or don't get back to you. Like, how do you deal with those situations that you don't have anything to work with?
Yes. Gosh, this tells me you've sold before because nobody who has sold has never had that. So what I do there is, again, complete and utter transparency. I have at times, it depends on the persona that you sell to, but there have been times where I will, like, you could mail someone, like physically mail someone just a picture of an elephant sitting in a room by itself. And then just underneath it be like, I got to address the elephant in the room. My thinking is either this, or this happened, but I might be wildly off. I was thinking about our conversation, like how far off base am I? And you don't have to physically mail. I just try to get out of patterns of just sending emails all the time or making calls. Like you could do any of the channels that you have available to you. But my point is when you humanize it and you come again with the same exact thinking as the last question, I've done some thinking around where I think maybe this went off the rails. And I'm simply asking you for you to correct me. That is so much easier of a reply than when someone says, hey, we had these great conversations. What happened? Now I have to like sit down and write, and then I start feeling guilty. Like I think sometimes we forget these are human beings with feelings. Nobody likes to be the person that says no. So make it easier on them by giving them some options and then say, I might be totally off base though. Can you correct me? That is one thing that rarely has failed me. I almost always get a reply from that. And the last tip I'll say is at the end of that email, soften it so it doesn't sound desperate by saying either way. So an example would be either way, truly enjoyed learning about how you're doing X, or either way, was excited to see the last round that you raised. Like something that shows I'm not just trying to suck the sales out of you. Like I do genuinely value our conversation. I think people will be more receptive that way.
Jen, you have dropped so many pearls of wisdom. So this is the final
Thanks.
question. This is a question we
Okay.
ask all of our guests. And it is about maintaining a winning mindset in the face of challenges. Our audience is mostly founders who have not sold before. And then suddenly they learn to sell and it's like, oh my gosh, there's so much rejection. Even if you're doing it well, you're mostly seeing rejection. And so how do you maintain a winning mindset in the face of all those challenges?
So this is funny you asked this because I just had this conversation with our 12-year-old kid because he's so intense about basketball. And he came home from practice last night and he was beating himself up because he had a bad practice. And we always do the same thing. We're like, Nikki, think about any professional basketball player. Think about any professional baseball player. They are at the top of their game. Like we're talking all-stars. And at best, like a great basket or baseball player is hitting a 300 batting average. Like that is the top of the top. That's sales. Like if you go into sales and realize that 7 times out of 10, I'm probably going to hear no, then all of a sudden the no's don't hit as hard. And the most important thing I think to maintain a winning mindset outside of just going in with that belief of like, I am going to lose more than I win. That's just what I signed up for, is just learning something from every loss. That's honestly what kept me in a frontline selling role for 18 years, is because I would always learn something. And then that motivated me to say, now I'm going to try to do this instead of that the next time around. And I'm going to see how that goes. And I think when you can keep learning in any role, but particularly sales, it keeps you excited for the next at bat. And that's the most important thing, because when you start to lose the passion, you start to lose the fire, prospects pick up on that. You're going to lose more than you win. Full stop.
Absolutely. Yeah, someone here in the comments, Rose, I can listen to Jen all day. That's how I feel too, Rose.
Thank you. That's so nice.
This was incredible. You are phenomenal. I'm so, so grateful that you joined us today. And oh my gosh, I think we have so much to digest and I want to re-listen again and again. Congratulations to everyone on the call for being here and to learn from Jen and do your part of learning today, learning and getting that much, just that a little bit better every day. That's the key to winning. So love it. Would love great way to end. Hope everyone else has a great rest of the day. Thanks so much, Jen.
Can I just make one quick plug?
Yes, plug.
So I think I dropped it in the chat, but tomorrow that's where I'll do the deep dive on selling to buying groups, how you get consensus. And then for anybody that is like working on a cold email motion, I do a Sunday newsletter where if you sign up and you send in one of your cold emails, I'll anonymize it. Well, I just butchered that word. Anonymize it. I will rewrite the cold email and walk through why I changed what I changed. So I pick one every week and I use it. Even if your own email doesn't get picked, what I hear from a lot of my readers is like, shoot, I was making the same mistake. So if you are working on that front end of prospecting, sign up for it. Even if you don't submit your own, you can do that. And I share a lot of like my upcoming events and tactics and things like that. So thank you for being here
Everybody go
today.
sign up. Is there a link where they can sign up for your newsletter? That you wanna
If you
put
just
in?
go to my website, it's front and center on my website. So I just dropped there.
Perfect. Thank you. And Kaveh said, we learned stuff they never teach in engineering school.
They don't
So
teach it in sales school either. So you got the goods. All right.
so many gems. Jen, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Have a great day.